Okay, we'd like to turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 5. Book of Genesis, chapter 5. We'll read verses 21 through 24, then verses 28 through 32, and then we'll go over to chapter 6. But in Genesis 5, verse 21, and Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begot Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Verse 28. And Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Ham, or Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then over in Genesis chapter 6, we'll read verses 7 through 9. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 through 26, we have the genealogy of Adam through the line of Cain, which I believe is a dishonorable list of the godless. I believe they are in line with, in Genesis 6:2, the daughters of men. And then in Genesis 5, it opens with, this is the book of the generations of Adam. This is followed by verses 1 and 2 by a reiteration of creation. And then you have the genealogy of Adam through the line of Seth, which I believe is the godly line, and they identify with the sons of God in Genesis 6, verse 2. So in Genesis 6:2, we have the mixing or blending together of these two lines, the godly and the ungodly. Still a problem today. In Genesis chapter 5, the actual genealogy begins with Adam, ends with Noah. A total of 1,056 years. Now, leading up to the portion of our text, verse 21 through 24, we have the record of Enoch. Now, there are 6 men or generations before you get to Enoch. There is Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, and Jared. So that makes Enoch the 7th. And we read in Jude verse 14 that Enoch is what? The 7th from Adam. Or if you do the math leading up to Enoch, you have 622 years. In our text, verses 21 through 24, we read of some additional details concerning the life of Enoch. And then following Enoch, verses 25 through 32, there is the record of three men or three generations, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. In verses 28 through 32, we come to the record of Noah. He, of course, is the 10th generation from Adam. And then coming to Genesis 6, we are told of the commingling, the mixing, the blending of these two lines. They begin to intermarry between the line of Cain and the line of Seth. And then in our text in chapter 6, verses 7 through 9, we read of additional details concerning Noah. So here in Genesis 5, there are 10 generations, 1,056 years from Adam to Noah. Looking at the years between Adam and Noah, here's how we come to that 1,056. Verse 3, and Adam lived 130 years and begat a son. We have 130 years. Verse 6, and Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. And then you go on down through verse 9, you have 90 years. Verse 12, you have 70. Verse 15, you have 65 years. Verse 18, you have 162 years. There are 622 years from Noah, from Adam to Enoch. From Enoch to Noah, verses 21, 25, and 28, you have 65 years, you have 187 years, you have 182 years. There are 434 years between Enoch and Noah. That means that Enoch died 69 years before his great-grandson Noah was born. So they never knew each other. It is also interesting to note that we're told in Genesis 7, verse 11, that Noah was 600 years old when it began to rain. From this, we see that it is not millions of years from Adam to the flood, but you add that 600 years to the 1,056 years, it is 1,656 years from Adam to the flood. That we see here from Genesis chapter 5. We arrive again at that number 1656 by adding the 600 to the 1056. In the genealogy, there are two men that stand out: Enoch and Noah. Coming to these two men in the genealogy, they're the only two that we are given additional details of their lives. Enoch, again, died 69 years before Noah was born. So Enoch and Noah never knew each other. Yet, they have so much in common. They were both righteous men. They were both very unique men in their day, in their society, in their environment. They both individually lived for God. They both individually had a testimony for God in a world that was crumbling and falling apart around them. 3 generations apart, and they both serve as an example for all generations. Both Enoch and Noah were the recipients of the miraculous work of God, and both received messages from God that transformed their lives. Twice in our text we read of Enoch, verse 22, verse 24. Enoch walked with God. And we read in Genesis 6, verse 9 concerning Noah. Noah walked with God. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. This does not just happen. This is not the norm. This is something extraordinary. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. These are miracle-based statements. Both of those statements involve the miraculous. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. These are life-defining words. We want to take the thought of the message from these 2 statements. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. Our subject this morning is step in step with God. First of all, we want to consider the background in which both of these men lived their lives or walked with God. First, they were both men. They were flesh and blood. Flesh and blood just like you and I. Being such, they had infirmities, they had limitations, they had sinful natures, which means that they had natural inclinations towards sin and natural inclinations away from God. We'd better realize that about our nature, about our flesh. We have natural inclinations towards sin, and we have natural inclinations away from God. Being men, they had temptations. They had inward battles and struggles. Yet we read that Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. Both of these men, secondly, had temporal matters to attend to. We read concerning Enoch in Genesis 5:21, and Enoch begat Methuselah. In verse 22, we read, and begat sons and daughters. Those 2 statements tell us this. Enoch had a wife. Enoch had sons. Enoch had daughters. We read in verse 25 that his son Methuselah begat Lamech. Enoch had a wife. He had sons. He had daughters. He had grandchildren. Enoch was a husband. He was a father. He was a grandfather. And Enoch walked with God. In Genesis 5:32, we read concerning Noah that he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And in Genesis 6, verse 10, he begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah had a wife. Noah had sons. We know from later on that he had daughters-in-laws. So both Enoch and Noah had families. What this means is that they had earthly responsibilities, but they walked with God. They had earthly burdens. You can't have a family without having burdens. They had earthly concerns. You cannot have a family and not have concerns. They had earthly trials. They had earthly difficulties. They had earthly troubles. They had distractions. Families can be a distraction when it comes to serving the Lord. Enoch and Noah had all of these things, but they walked with God. Also, we see they both lived in very challenging times. In Genesis 1, we read of a perfect creation, which received God's stamp of approval of being very good. Genesis 2 enlarges upon the creation of man, breaks down the creation of male and female. And then we see them, male and female, Adam and Eve, in the garden of God. A very special garden for man's joy, called Eden. It was an unimaginable, beautiful place. A garden of pure pleasure and delight. This garden is immense. You can't think of it, of course, as a garden in your yard. This garden has a river. This river breaks off into 4 rivers. This is an immense place. In this garden, there was harmony. There was peace. There was joy. There was harmony between Adam and Eve and God. And there was harmony between Adam and Eve. It was a place of sheer enjoyment with no unhappiness. A state of perfection. In that garden, Adam and Eve, husband and wife, walked with God. They walked with God. They were in communion with God. Their thoughts were pure. Their thoughts were God-honoring. Their thoughts were God-exalting. And their perspective was God's perspective. This is where man started. This is where he started. He started in perfection. And we read in Genesis 1:31, it was very good. No disorder, no chaos, no conflict, no struggle, no pain, no disease, no decline, no death. But by the time you get to the end of Genesis chapter 3, we see Adam and Eve, as a result of their sin against God, feeling something they never felt before. Shame. Guilt. And these two people who walked with God are now fleeing from God and trying to hide from God. Man began in perfection. Man did not begin in sin and getting better. Man began in perfection and is getting worse. Just the opposite of humanist philosophy. This sin would intensify. Coming to Genesis 4, we read of anger, jealousy, murder, and polygamy amongst mankind. So what we see now is sin is intensifying and it is prevailing more and more. Again, there are 622 years from Adam to Enoch. And during that 622 years, the difficulties, the troubles, the problems, the burdens due to sin were intensifying. They were prevailing more and more. Why? Because that's how sin works. The obstacles and the hurdles due to sin were intensifying and prevailing more and more. Why? Because that's how sin works. It's how it still works. The challenges, the opposition, and the discouragement due to sin were intensifying and prevailing more and more. The ungodliness, the corruption, the lust, the vanity, the worldly pleasure, the engrossment with the everyday affairs of life were intensifying and becoming more and more. Because that's what sin does. Oblivion toward God was intensifying and becoming more and more. Spiritual indifference, spiritual unresponsiveness, and spiritual trifling and rejecting God for their own self-interest was intensifying and prevailing more and more. The wickedness, the degeneration were intensifying and becoming more and more. Now there are 434 years between the births of Enoch and Noah, or 1,056 years from Adam to Noah. And during that time, sin and the results of sin only intensified and became more and more. Why? Because that's what sin does. So by the time you get to Noah, man has become so occupied, so consumed, so entangled and mired in the affairs of life, they are completely spiritually unaware. A time of oblivion toward God. When people were so caught up with the affairs of life that there was no room for God. And people lived as they pleased, gratifying their own lusts. Luke tells us in Luke 7:27-28 that they, speaking of the days of Noah, they did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage. You say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, with all those things, eat, drink, marry, just speak of common everyday life. The meaning is that they were so preoccupied with common everyday life that they were oblivious to God and oblivious to the message of God. And when Jesus comes, it'll be like the days of Noah. Coming to Noah, in Genesis chapter 6, we see that the commingling, the mixing, the blending of the two lines of Cain and Seth have intensified and prevailed more and more. By the time you get to Genesis 6, by the time you get to Noah, sin had so progressed that we hear God say in Genesis 6:3, "My spirit shall not always strive with man." In other words, I will not always put up restraints to man's depravity. God would remove, just as He is today, His restraining hand from the sinful passions of man. The result in Genesis 6:5, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of men was only evil continually." And then we hear God say in verse 7, "I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth." And in Genesis 6:12, "And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted the way upon earth. And in Genesis 6:13, and God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. By the time you get to Noah, days were marked by self-willed, demonic perverseness that had brought the ruin of social order and decency. And by the time of the flood, there were eight righteous souls. The righteous are getting fewer by the day. By the time Jesus comes, there won't be many. There won't be many. So we see the background in which these two men lived. Now consider the lives of Enoch and Noah. They both individually lived for God. They had a testimony for God. They both were abnormal and peculiar. Neither were governed or defined by their times or their circumstances. Enoch and Noah were insistent, relentless, and resilient for God. They were both men of faith. We read in Hebrews 11, verse 5, by faith, Enoch. We read in Hebrews 11, verse 7, by faith, Noah. In the midst of oblivion to God, Enoch had faith. In the midst of oblivion to God, Noah had faith. What this means is that Enoch and Noah were persuaded of God. Oh, that God's people would have a persuasion of God. Enoch and Noah had confidence in God. In the midst of self-reliance, Enoch and Noah depended on God. They relied upon God. They had unreserved trust in God. They leaned upon God. They rested in God. They clave to God. They looked to God. This is what faith does. They came to God. They cast themselves upon God. They saw God. They embraced God. They believed and acted upon the omnipotence of God, upon the omnipresence of God, upon the omniscience of God, the sovereignty of God, the love of God, the goodness of God, the truthfulness of God. By faith, they lived their lives. And if you and I do not live our lives by faith, we will live like the world. They lived by faith. They were both men of testimony. They both testified of God. They both proclaimed God. We read in Jude 14 that Enoch prophesied. We read in 2 Peter 2:5 that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. They declared God. Our lives ought to declare God. They declared God. We read of Enoch in Hebrews 11 verse 5 that he had this testimony, that he pleased God. What a testimony. He pleased God. he pleased God. And we read of Noah in Genesis 6, verse 9. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. That's an important statement in the context. The daughters of men and the sons of God were intermingling. But Noah was perfect in his generations. He rose above the sins of the times. So both Enoch and Noah pointed to God. Their lives pointed to God. Their lives manifested God. Oh, for lives that would point to God and manifest God. And then we see they lived their lives walking with God. We twice read Enoch walked with God. It is stated once that Noah walked with God. Throughout the Word of God, the word walk is used to describe one's habitual way of life. It is the overall course of their life. Both these men had sins in their lives. We know what happened to Noah later on. But the overall course of their life was that they walked with God. How many can say, looking at your life, looking at our lives, they walked with God? The overall course, we're going to fail. But the overall course should be they walked with God. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. That means the overall habit and course of their life was with God. Was with God. Brother Dave said this morning, the storms are coming. Whether you build your house on the rock or the sand, they're coming. But let me tell you something. With God makes all the difference. If I'm going to go through a storm, I want to go through it with God. The overall course of their life was with God. The activities of their life were moving in the same direction as God. Enoch and Noah walked with God. Walked with God. Together with God. It doesn't get any better than that. Together with God. Adam and Eve were together with God. And then they decided to go their own way, and we're still suffering the consequences. Together with God. That needs to be our motto. Together with God. That needs to be us individually. That needs to be true of husbands and wives. That needs to be true of churches. Together with God. That should be our life. They walked with God. They lived their life in conjunction with God. They lived jointly with God. Side by side with God. In correlation with God. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. They lived their life on common ground with God. In a world that was doing anything but. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. To walk with somebody, you've got to be in the same place they are. They lived in the same place as God. They weren't trying to hide from God. They weren't trying to flee from God. They lived in the same place of God, and they were walking. If you're walking with somebody, you're not going in opposite directions. You're going in the same direction. And guess what? You're going at the same pace also. A walk, when you think of a walk, you don't usually think of going backwards. Most people don't walk backwards. You think of advancement. They walked with God. They were advancing. You want to advance? Walk with God. They were advancing with God. They were advancing in the same direction as God. Their purpose of life is moving in the same direction as God. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. Their lives were not being dictated by their own devices or by their flesh. Their lives were in stark contrast with the course of the world. You walk with God, you're going the opposite direction of the world because the world's fleeing from God. The world's trying to hide from God. You walk with God, you're going in the opposite direction of most saved people. Enoch walked with God, Noah walked with God. They knew God. They knew God personally. And they knew God by daily experience. You walk with somebody long enough, you'll get to know them. I'm not speaking of a second-hand knowledge here. I'm not speaking of a knowledge of theory. But Enoch walked with God, Noah walked with God, and they knew God as a result of their walk with God. They knew God as a result of their close association and contact with God. This is a knowledge of kinship. This is a knowledge of friendship. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. God was not some distant deity to them. They walked with Him. They walked with Him. In the midst of everything and no matter what happened, Enoch knew God personally. Not just what he heard of God, but he knew God personally. And Noah knew God personally. God was real to Enoch. God was real to Noah. His voice was real. His touch was real. His power was real. His love was real. These weren't just things they heard of, they were real. His kindness, His long-suffering, His mercy, His grace, His care, His presence. These were all personal experiences of Enoch and Noah. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. And as they walked with God, there was a growth of their knowledge of God. There was a growth of their experience with God. We ought to be growing in our knowledge of God. I'm not just talking about facts. I'm talking about personal experience. There was growth in their fellowship with God. You walk with somebody long enough, your fellowship grows. If it doesn't, guess what? You won't walk together. You'll stop somewhere along the way. The fellowship with God became more and more meaningful every day. Through the various seasons, through the various needs of life, and through the various difficulties and battles and struggles, and through the various sorrows and trials and burdens of life, Enoch had a nearness to God. Noah had a nearness to God, and they were in contact with God. They were in contact with God. They were right with God. Again, the storms are coming. It's best just to stay right with God. That way, when the storms come, you don't have to spend the whole day getting right with Him in order to pray. You're already ready to pray. They walked with God. They lived their life drawing near to God. How near to God are we? Are we drawing near day by day? Are we nearer today than we were yesterday? Or last week or the week before? They were drawing near to God. They lived life feeding upon God. They live life seeing God. You walk with somebody, you see them. They live life feeling God. They live life experiencing God's refreshment, His strength, His direction, His counsel, His consolation, and His peace. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. See Enoch with God. See him there with God. See Noah with God. There's companionship with God. There's association with God. There's identification with God. You cannot walk with somebody and not be aware of their presence. They lived their life aware of God. The whole world was living in oblivion to God. But they lived their life aware of God. They lived their life observing God. You need to be so close with God that you can observe Him. You can observe Him. They lived their life occupied with God. A lot going on all around them. But they were occupied with God. They walked with God. And I believe as they did, they enjoyed God. How few enjoy God. You walk with God, you will enjoy the Lord. As they walked with God, they thought upon God. They talked to God. I believe they praised Him, they worshiped Him. That's what you'll do when you walk with God. Enoch walked with God, Noah walked with God. And the further they walked, there was a conformity to God. God was the subject of their life. Again, I'm speaking overall. God was the theme. He was the highlight. He was the main feature. What is it today? Can you be honest? Can you tell God, don't tell me, tell God, that He is the subject of your life? Tell Him that. Can you tell Him that? I know you can tell Him that, but can you tell Him that honestly? That He is the theme. That He is the substance. That He's the highlight. He's the priority. That's what it means to walk with God. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. God was the influential force in their life. Can you look to God and honestly say, God, You are the influential force and the energy of my life. God was the dominating factor of their life. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. Their lives were distinct from all that was around them. And again, as you observe these two walking with God, you see they're moving in the opposite direction in the world. Anyone can go with the current. Any religious person can go with the current. But it takes something special to constantly go against the current. That's what they did. The principles of their life, the motives of their life, the focus of their life, the goals of their life, the object of their lives was God. They're moving in the same direction as God. In spite of the natural inclinations of their flesh, and in the midst of family issues and circumstances, and in the midst of earthly responsibilities and surrounded by a dysfunctional world, Noah and Enoch walked with God. And so can we. They lived on common ground with God. Their lives were not bound by the norm of the world. Now we're told concerning Enoch that he walked with God for 300 years. He very well may have walked with God to some degree the first 65 years of his life. But when it says that he walked with God for 300 years, he's now on a completely different level. Right now, we ought to be on a completely different level in our walk with God than we were 5 years ago or a year ago. It ought to be a completely different level. As the years go by, we ought to be walking with God in a way that we didn't before. Enoch walked with God 300 years. He did not just do this for a little while and then back off. 300 years. This was not an occasional thing. This was not an erratic thing. This was not an isolated incident. Here's the problem today in so-called Christianity. When people do what they ought to do and have a relationship with God that they ought to have, sadly, they are isolated incidents. It needs to be our life. For 300 years, he walked with God. For 3,600 months, Enoch walked with God. 15,600 weeks, Enoch walked with God. Can we even do it for a week? For 109,500 days, the activity and the direction of his life was with God. This is not some isolated incident. Almost 110,000 days. Enoch walked with God. The direction of his life was with God. The pace of his life was with God. For 300 years. 300 years, a lot of change goes on. For 300 years, Whether the wind was blowing against him or whether the wind wasn't blowing at all, Enoch walked with God. Circumstances were not the determining factor. During the course of those 300 years, remember, Enoch was a family man. 300 years, there's a lot of change that takes place in a family. But Enoch walked with God throughout all the change. No doubt in a span of 300 years, there were days and seasons of calamity. There were days and seasons of trouble. There were days and seasons of adversity. There were days and seasons of mourning and heartache and struggle. And Enoch walked with God. He walked with God. And there were days and seasons of great joy. And there were days and seasons of abundant blessings. But no matter what a day brought forth, Enoch walked with God. That should be us. For 300 years, he believed God. Oh, people will say, I believe God. Well, why don't you live like it? It's easy to say we believe God. Live like it. Live like we believe God. For 300 years he sought God. And he came to God. And he walked with God. I don't think we're aware of how easy it is to get off course. You spend a day and you don't draw closer to God, you've gotten way off course, more than you even realize. And if that carries into the next day, and then the next day, people are so far from God, they're unaware. They're unaware. And they come to church on Wednesdays and Sundays and they think that makes them close to God. You can walk in that door and God be 10 miles away. Doesn't mean you walk in the door with God. We're to walk in the door with God and we're to walk out the door with God. And on our way home, we're to do it with God. 300 years of blessed testimony and pleasing God. Enoch had this testimony that he pleased God. 300 years. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. There they are, together with God. Side by side with God. May we see ourselves in that picture. May we see ourselves together with God. Side by side with God. So in closing, Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. Oh, may we every day seek to step out with God. You get up every morning, it ought to be with God. You go outside of your house, it ought to be with God. Whatever comes, you go with God. Whatever comes. Whether it be joyous times or sorrowful times, step by step with God. Whether it be trying times or blessed times, step by step with God. Whether it be in the dark or the light, step by step with God. Whether it be in the unknown or the known, step by step with God. Whether it be through enemy territory or with friends, step by step with God. There's no better way. There's no better way to live your life than step by step with God. I'll put it very bluntly. If we're not living our lives step by step with God, we're not right with God. People seem to think that they have to commit some horrible sin what they characterize as horrible. And that causes them not to be right with God. No, all you have to do is step out without Him. That's all you have to do. And you're not right with God. May we each day seek God to change us. We have to be changed in order to walk with Him. And then a consistent walk with God will bring about change. You can't walk with God and not be changed. It's not even possible. The end result of a walk with God is seen in Genesis 5:24. And he was not, for God took him. That is explained in Hebrews 11:5, where 3 times you have the words translated or translation, meaning to carry across, to change from one place to another. Enoch walked with God, and God picked him up and carried him from one domain to the other. Now I realize that literally happened to Enoch, but there's a figurative lesson there for you and I. If we walk with God, God will pick us up and carry us from one domain to the other. We won't live on the same level as this world. He was literally raised above the world. And that is a picture of the life that we can live walking with God. We will be raised above this world. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The world couldn't hold him down. You walk with God, the world can't hold you down. And people say, I try, it's just too hard, or this circumstance happened. What you're saying is, I don't walk with God. Because if you walk with God, the world can't hold you down. You rise above the world. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That is a picture of a life regulated by heavenly principles and not fleshly motives and worldly interest. It is a picture of a life lived victorious over the pull and the force of the world. The world pulls at me and pulls at you every single day. But you walk with God, the world can only pull you so far. It is a picture of one who is not taken in and consumed by the influence of the world, of one who's not stuck in the world. Most of God's people, or who profess to be God's people, are stuck. They're stuck. You walk with God, you won't be stuck. You will not be defined by this world. It is a picture, let's walk with God, is a picture of an abundant and flourishing life. A life lived in the peace of the Lord as the result of walking with God. Look back at your life. Can you see the footprints? And are those footprints in line with His? What a wonderful life. If you can look back and overall, you see that your footprints are in line with His. What a life. And if they're not, what a waste. What a waste. But if our footprints are in line with God, that means overall that we have lived our lives together with God. not in just some isolated incident. We have lived our lives in conjunction with God. We have lived our lives jointly with God, side by side with God. Look at your life. Look at your life. Is it with God? It's a very basic question. Is it with God? Walk with God. There's no better way to live. That's always good advice. Walk with God. Go with God. Brother John, if you come and lead us in verse song, let's all